We come to the 8th section of our study in 1 Corinthians, and we come to chapter 14, a rather extensive narrative. It would seem that if you might look at what Paul is doing, you might think of it as if he takes a glass bottle, or he sees a glass bottle or jar that has been dropped. And he sees all these fractured pieces, all the slivers and all the little pieces of glass. And even if he's not going to be able to put the whole thing back together again, he keeps on sweeping things together. He keeps on saying, let's get every little bit of this and gather it back together. Let's look for all the different ways in which there is a fracturing and a splitting. And let's see if we can't bring this as close as we can to being one single jar again. The archaeologist who will go into a dig site might surprisingly not find all the pieces of a pot that have been broken. Who knows whether there was a piece that was kicked around and moved elsewhere when the broken pottery was at the surface. And so you'll see in restorations of pottery, you'll see all the cracks and all the pieces that are put together, and there may even have to be places where they will simply put new plaster or new clay into a hole to try to fill it, and simply show what the pot would have looked like even if all the pieces aren't there. That's what Paul is doing. He is saying this body of believers has all the pieces. At least the Lord's given them all. But it may be that it's been fractured or damaged so much, or could be that it will be broken once again. It's been put together, and in one sense it is as strong as eternity. But in another sense, there are those who can make it weak, who can damage it, who can fracture it, who can pull it apart. And thus part of the task is to recognize where those dangers are and keep them from happening. In chapter 14, the basic issue begins with speaking in tongues, but then goes on to who has a right to speak for the congregation. Apparently what has been going on here is there were some people who said, well, I have a very high special gift. I can speak in tongues, and all you can do is speak messages you heard from others. To understand it this way, we need to assume that when Paul talks about prophesying, that he is talking about speaking on behalf of the Lord. If we are speaking in tongues, that sounds more to be something where the person is praising God in a language that maybe he or she does not even understand, and that nobody around them understands. Paul says, that's wonderful if you can do that. He says, I do that too. But I do that privately. I do that when it's just the praise welling up from me to God. So he doesn't deny that there is speaking the ability to speak in tongues, but he simply says that's not going to do the body any good unless somebody knows what you're doing. You have just a little bit of time to gather together. Don't waste it. Don't make it something where somebody is a show-off. If it's not of benefit to the entire body, it's not worth doing. And thus, Paul says, seek to love and to prophesy. And if you have tongues, that's fine. But the tongues deal with the mysteries of God, and we're not going to be able to always know what's going on in the depth of the mysteries. It may be that this is how Paul says he was aware of the depth of the higher level of knowledge. But he says that's not the way to be fighting with other Christians. And prophecy is going to go to others to build up the church, and that's why you gather together. Now, the issue is not as pressing as it was when I was just growing up, and my early years in the ministry. There was still some discussion about the speaking in tongues as an issue that was very divisive in our churches. Part of the problem, as I heard about it then as well, was that some people were told if you can't speak in tongues, you really aren't a dedicated or mature Christian. This often gets brought in with the charismatic gifts, and when someone's talked about as a charismatic, the two types of gifts that are usually mentioned are the gifts of speaking in tongues and healing. Now, that theory would say that there are levels of gifts, and that if somebody has the lowest gift, maybe that person has some gift of mercy or giving or something like that, but that the higher gifts are the ones where you can actually see the activity of God in the person, and you wouldn't mistake it for being just something that that person can do. If I can do a good job of cutting and trimming and cleaning up my lawn, or washing my car, or painting my house, or painting my garage, someone might say, well, you don't have to be spiritual to do that. But if I would be able to pray in foreign languages or in other languages, or lay my hands on someone, and that person all of a sudden is freed from their lameness or their blindness or their deafness, then somebody might say, wow, you really have those gifts. It is interesting that Jesus is never described as having spoken in tongues. What he does when he prays privately with his Father is not recorded for us. But it's not as if Jesus says, well, I have that gift. He does obviously have the gift of healing, and he can give that gift to whomever he will. But if I say you're not a mature Christian until you have been baptized by the Spirit and can speak in tongues and can lay hands on others and heal them, if I say, well, you maybe had water baptism, but you don't look any different than the other person on the street, and you really are not maybe to trust that you are really alive in the Spirit until those things happen, then I will have done a great disservice. And so Paul says in chapter 14, verses 6 to 12, that there is a need for clarity when people are gathering together. There's a need to be able to intelligently say, this is what message we have from God. When we ask the Lord, what is he talking about? We hear him teaching. We hear through the Gospels that he's instructing his disciples about what it means that he's suffering and dying and rising, and what the work with others will be. And the point is that we are to do what will build up everyone, not what will just show us off and make us unique. If what I do is something that helps the whole congregation, then it's wonderful. If what I do is simply to say, I want to draw attention to myself, then if that is done in such a way that I am seen as the important one instead of the Lord, then that activity is to stop. Now, we're in a bind. Sometimes we have gifts that we want to use, and somebody else might say, well, that you're just showing off. But the way to understand that is the gift that we have conveying the love and mercy of Christ? Or is it something that is just calling attention to ourselves? No matter how we do that, we are going to obviously be seen and visible by others. But if our concern is for the other person and not for ourselves, then that is the best that we can possibly do. In chapter 14, verses 13 to 19, Paul says if there are people who are going to speak in tongues, then make sure there is someone there to do the interpreting. Because it's not just something that we are doing that everyone else will look at, but it ought to be of benefit. And we have no case that I know of in the New Testament where someone has spoken in tongues and we then have an interpretation of what was said. So we have no record of exactly what was happening. But Paul keeps on talking about the other person. Build up the other person. He says, I talk 10,000 words in speaking in tongues, but I wouldn't do that in the midst of a worshiping congregation if I had 5 words that I could say that someone would know. Because that's the place where you gather to be built up. So privately, if we speak in tongues, which I've never been able to do and never really asked for, or whether it is our private prayers where we are reading the scriptures, that is not something that necessarily will be told to everyone. We don't have to take the private things of our relationship with God and share absolutely every one of them. Paul goes on to say in verses 20 to 25, decide where you're going to be a baby and where you're going to be a grown-up. Don't be a crybaby who always has to be the center of attention. Be a grown-up in that you're thinking about what it is to be a child of God. If you want to be a baby in knowing what evil is all about. You don't have to know everything that's wrong. You don't have to know every problem in this world. Remember, God didn't say that we should know evil and good. He made us to know good. him alone, and he said, keep far away from evil, don't take of the fruit of the tree. And so Paul says, we don't have to dig into the world on purpose to try out every kind of problem. In that sense, let's stay far away from it. But in our relationship with one another, let's be mature. And that maturity is in the sense of us valuing the others and the gifts that they have, and doing that which will build somebody else up. To share when there are times when we've been down and discouraged, and the Lord has healed us. The Lord has strengthened us. The Lord has helped us to see hope when all we could see was disappointment and discouragement. Thus, he says, prophecy is what will be used to talk to believers, to tell others about the things of God, and not just to carry about on one's own. Those things, in other words, which will say God is among us. Verses 26 to 33 continue that theme of building up. Remember earlier we talked about that we are God's temple and God's building on the foundation of Christ. And Paul says, even if you've got someone who can interpret the tongues, 2 or maybe 3 people as you gather together, don't make this a cause of fighting and concern. So Paul's attacking people who are saying, we're really at the top. Probably those same people who were saying to Paul, you're not much because you didn't come speaking with much knowledge and you didn't come asking for much money. And it may be that he's been gradually building to this, to say to those people, you ought to be ashamed of yourselves, that you think you're the mature ones, and really you're making trouble for others. You're trying to fly the plane when it's the Lord who's in the cockpit. And as he says this, he says, better be silent about such things than to try to push your way in. All of a sudden then, out of the clear blue, he starts talking about the role of women speaking in the church in verses 34 to 36. You'll remember that a couple chapters ago, he said when women are prophesying, speaking about what the Lord has done, they're to have their head covered, which means they were talking in the worship. Now he says women are to be silent in the church. Well, what's going on? If it is someone who says, and this is where we get into difficult territory and struggle with this in our own church body as well. But it would seem that what Paul is getting at is, if those who were speaking in tongues were trying to lord it over others, then they should be silent. And in the same way, if there were women who were saying, we are now superior to anyone else, we have the Spirit, and everything coming out of us is exactly right, then they too were to be told to keep silence in the church, as Paul says was true in their culture as well. Now let's ask the question, does Paul talk about this as something that is only a time-bound custom, or does he talk about this in the role or in the sense that he does back in the previous chapter, where he says that the wife is subordinate to the husband? The main thing seems to be where Paul says, let them ask at home if they have any questions, that maybe there was a kind of an overstating of the case, a talking out loud whenever someone said, well, I think this is right, and I think that is right, and what are you doing this for, and what are you doing that for? In the culture, women were to keep silence. They were to have no role whatsoever, and they were to discuss things at home with their husbands. Paul says here, if you're going to get in that position where you're going to be lording it over others, do you think you're the only ones who got the message and who have heard from the Lord? Then he says it's shameful that such things are going on in the worship service. And because God is the head, then we are to stay in a relationship where we are under his authority. Well, we're going to have troubles in the church on this one, because there are people who would say, women who would say, I don't speak out of turn. I have listened, and I want to prophesy. I want to speak the Lord's message. And I'm not trying to be superior. I simply want to say what I believe the Lord has called me to say. We're going to have to ask that question. Where is that appropriate? How is that done? decently and in order so that there is peace that comes from it. And we're going to have to balance the passage that says women are to prophesy with their heads covered, which means they were speaking in the congregation from the Lord about what he had done, versus when somebody might be saying, this is my opinion. Does it call for absolute silence? If it did, women would not sing in choirs. No. But we're going to have to ask that question in terms of when it is proper to say how that one can share faith with others, and we need to ask the Lord to guide us, to understand, so we can go deeper than just what the culture of our day is, and not say, well, because of the role of women in society, we can have the same role in the church, but at the same time, not to try to go so far as to ignore that Paul himself was giving counsel about the way in which women could speak in the church, whether in church meetings or in church gatherings, the situation being very, very different. And obviously more discussion is needed than we can give right now, but to be sensitive to the fact that Paul's been arguing all along about that which fractures the body and splits it into a bunch of little different groups, and that his concern is that everyone is one together and is serving those around the outside and on the edge. Obviously, the role of men and women in the church is seen in such an important way as that men and women can go forth and witness to their faith and touch others with his forgiving love. And that really is the essence of what our Lord has made us to be. So in conclusion to this section, Paul says that all things are to be done decently and in order, and comes back to the issue about the speaking in tongues, and says, let this be something that is not a cause for division. Keep it to yourself if you need to. Ask that there will be interpretation, and if there's not, then don't be bringing that up at all. Don't be lording your gift when really your gift is to be that which would serve others. Again, very difficult for us in all of these social interactions. We all have the tensions of what's the will of the Lord, what's the pressure of the world, how can we understand how to value all the gifts that are given and not squelch them, how can we look at all of those who are in the church and see that every part is important for the upbuilding of the body of Christ. And we can simply ask the Lord to keep guiding us and helping us to evaluate the answers that we give so that they are pleasing to him, and help all of those who are in the church to recognize the ways in which they are all important and functioning members of the body. God continue to bless you as you continue your study of this letter. Thank you.